The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty plains as Sarah Turner clutched her infant daughter tighter against the biting cold of the Montana Territory, 1876. 3 days on foot from the nearest town, her husband 6 feet under back in Silverton, and nothing but a few scraps of cloth to keep her baby warm, Sarah had never felt more alone in her 22 years of life. The distant howl of wolves sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the approaching night. As darkness fell, the flicker of a campfire in the distance beckoned like a lighthouse to a drowning sailor. With her last ounce of strength, Sarah stumbled toward that promise of salvation, praying that whoever tended that fire had more mercy than the wilderness surrounding them. Sarah's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she approached the campfire. Her feet ached from walking miles in worn-out boots, and her arms burned from holding her baby close for so long. Little Emma had been mercifully quiet, too weak from hunger to cry much anymore. The rags Sarah had scavenged from her husband's bloodied shirt after the stagecoach robbery were barely enough to shield the 3-month-old from the elements. As she neared the camp, a tall figure stood up, silhouetted against the flames. Sarah froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, a lone woman with a baby approaching a stranger's camp at nightfall. "Who goes there?" The man's voice was deep, but not threatening. "Please," Sarah managed, her voice cracking from thirst. "My baby, we need help." The man approached cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. As he came closer, the firelight revealed a weathered face with kind eyes beneath the brim of a worn Stetson. He couldn't have been more than 28, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. "Madam," he said, taking in her desperate state. "You look half frozen." Sarah swayed on her feet, exhaustion finally claiming her. "My baby. Please help my baby." The man moved quickly as Sarah's knees buckled. He caught her with one arm while being careful not to crush the small bundle she clutched to her chest. As Sarah's vision darkened around the edges, she saw the stranger look down at Emma, whose tiny face peeked out from the blood-stained rags. "You're safe now," was the last thing she heard before consciousness slipped away. When Sarah awoke, she was wrapped in a warm blanket beside the fire. Panic seized her instantly. Where was Emma? She bolted upright, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull her back down. "Easy there," came that same deep voice. "Your little one's right here." Across the fire, the cowboy sat with Emma cradled in his arms. He had unwrapped the dirty rags and replaced them with what looked like a clean flannel shirt, expertly bundled around her tiny form. The baby was awake, staring up at the man with wide blue eyes. "I gave her a bit of warm goat's milk," he explained. "Had some in my supplies for coffee. Figured she needed it more than I did." Sarah tried to stand, but found her legs wouldn't cooperate. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." The cowboy carefully stood and brought Emma to her mother. "Name's Jake Xavier," he said as he gently placed the baby in Sarah's arms. "Most folks call me Jake." "Sarah Turner," she replied, tears of relief streaming down her face as she examined her daughter. Emma looked better already, some color returning to her previously pale cheeks. "And this is Emma." Jake nodded. "Pleased to meet you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He moved back to the other side of the fire and poured something from a pot into a tin cup. "Drink this. It's just broth, but it'll warm you up." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, sipping the hot liquid while keeping one arm securely around Emma. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Xavier." "Jake," he corrected. "And no thanks needed. Couldn't leave a woman and baby out in this wilderness. Not and call myself a man." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "Mind telling me how you ended up out here alone?" Sarah's eyes dropped to Emma's face. "My husband Thomas and I were on the stagecoach to Fort Benton. We were going to start fresh. He had a job waiting at a mercantile." Her voice caught. Bandits stopped the coach 3 days back. They shot the driver and Thomas when he tried to protect me. I ran while they were looting the other passengers. I've been walking ever since, trying to reach the next town. Jake's expression hardened. The Blackwater gang, most likely. They've been hitting coaches along this route for months. He shook his head. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Turner. Sarah, she said quietly, I'm not sure I feel much like a Mrs. anymore. Jake nodded solemnly. You've been through hell, Sarah, but you and your little one are safe now. He stood and added more wood to the fire. Come morning, I'll take you both to Redemption. It's a small town about a day's ride from here. They've got a doctor who can look at your baby. You'd do that for strangers? Sarah asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Jake's mouth curved into a small smile. Out here, kindness might be rare, but that makes it all the more important. He gestured to his bedroll. You and Emma take my blankets tonight. I'll keep watch. Sarah wanted to protest but was too exhausted. She carefully arranged Emma beside her on the bedroll and pulled the blankets tight around them both. Despite her grief and fear, the warmth and relative safety allowed sleep to claim her quickly. Through half-closed eyes, she watched as Jake sat with his back against his saddle, rifle across his lap, his gaze alternating between the darkness beyond their camp and the woman and child he had just sworn to protect. Morning brought pale sunlight and a fresh chill to the air. Sarah woke to find Jake already up, cooking something over a small fire. Emma was awake in her arms, making soft cooing noises that Sarah hadn't heard in days. Morning, Jake said, noticing her stirring. Hope you like flapjacks. Not much else in my provisions that's suitable for breakfast. Sarah sat up, adjusting Emma in her arms. Flapjacks sound wonderful. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. The events of the past few days had turned food into an afterthought. There's a stream about 50 yards that way, Jake said, pointing. Water's cold but clean if you want to freshen up. I'll watch the little one. Sarah hesitated, looking down at Emma. Jake seemed to understand her reluctance. I've got 7 nieces and nephews back in Kansas, he explained. Spent enough time around babies to keep this one content for a few minutes. Still, Sarah wavered. Emma was all she had left in the world. I understand if you don't trust me yet, Jake said quietly, but I promise you, on my honor, that no harm will come to either of you while you're in my care. Something in his steady gaze convinced Sarah. She carefully handed Emma to him, watching as his large, calloused hands cradled her daughter with surprising gentleness. I won't be long, she promised, getting to her feet. The cold water of the stream was shocking but refreshing. Sarah quickly washed her face and hands, trying to remove the dirt of days spent traveling through the wilderness. She caught her reflection in the still water of a small pool-hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, and hair that had come loose from its once neat bun. She barely recognized herself. When she returned to camp, the sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Jake sat by the fire, Emma cradled in one arm while he flipped flapjacks with his free hand. He was speaking softly to the baby, who stared up at him with rapt attention. Your mama's been mighty brave getting you this far, he was saying. And you're a brave little lady too, aren't you? Hardly making a fuss even though you must be hungry and uncomfortable. The tenderness in his voice brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. For days, she had been completely alone in her fear and grief. Now, watching this stranger showing such gentle care toward her daughter, the emotional dam broke. A sob escaped her before she could stop it. Jake looked up, concern crossing his features. Sarah, are you all right? She nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, I'm sorry, it's just... Thank you. For being kind. Jake looked almost embarrassed. Just doing what anyone would do. No, Sarah said firmly as she approached. Not anyone. The world has more monsters than heroes, I've learned. She sat down across from him and accepted Emma back into her arms. "You're one of the good ones, Jake Xavier." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, Jake occasionally pointing out birds or wildlife to distract Sarah from her thoughts. After they finished, he efficiently packed up the camp while Sarah tended to Emma. "My horse can carry us all to redemption," Jake explained as he saddled the large chestnut gelding. "Samson's strong enough, and it's not too far." Sarah eyed the horse warily. "I haven't ridden much." Jake finished securing his bedroll to the saddle. "You'll ride in front where I can make sure you and Emma don't fall. Samson's gentle as they come." Once everything was packed, Jake helped Sarah mount, carefully passing Emma up to her once she was settled. Then he swung up behind her, one arm securely around her waist while the other held the reins. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Sarah nodded, hyper-aware of his proximity. It had been days since she'd felt safe, and despite barely knowing this man, his presence was steadying. They rode throughout the morning, Jake keeping Samson at an easy pace to avoid jostling the baby. He pointed out landmarks and shared stories about his life as a ranch hand and sometimes scout for the army. Sarah learned he was 27, had grown up in Kansas, and had been working his way through Montana for the past 3 years. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "Where were you before the stagecoach?" Sarah adjusted Emma, who had fallen asleep against her chest. "Ohio originally. Thomas and I married young. I was 18. He was 20. My parents didn't approve. They wanted me to marry the banker's son." She sighed. "We headed west looking for opportunity. Thomas was a clerk, good with numbers. We thought Montana would offer a fresh start." "And now?" Jake asked gently. Sarah stared at the horizon. "Now I don't know. I have no family to return to, no money, no skills beyond keeping house." She looked down at Emma. "But I have her. She deserves a chance at a good life." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Redemption's a decent town. Sheriff's a fair man. There's a widow there, Mrs. Peterson, who runs a boarding house. She might have work for you. You know her well?" "Stayed there when I've passed through. She lost her husband and son in the war. Takes in strays of all sorts now." His arm tightened slightly around Sarah's waist as they navigated a rocky patch. "She'd help a woman with a baby, I'm certain of it." The sun was high overhead when they stopped to rest near a small copse of trees. Jake helped Sarah down from Samson before dismounting himself. Emma had awakened and was beginning to fuss. "She's probably hungry again," Sarah said, bouncing the baby gently. "I still have a little milk left from what you gave her last night." Jake nodded. "I'll heat some water, make it easier on her stomach." He moved efficiently, gathering small sticks for a fire. As Sarah fed Emma, she watched Jake. There was something comforting about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. He didn't waste words or actions. In her previous life in Ohio, she'd been surrounded by men who valued appearance over substance, men who talked endlessly about their achievements, but would balk at the kind of hardship Jake seemed to take in stride. "You're staring," Jake said without looking up from the fire he was building. Sarah blushed. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking." "About?" "How different you are from the men I knew back east." She adjusted Emma against her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. They talked more, did less. Jake's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Out here, talking too much can get you killed. Better to listen." He struck a match and lit the kindling. "Your husband, was he a talker or a doer?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "Thomas was somewhere in between, I suppose. He had dreams, big ones, talked about them often, but he worked hard too." She paused, memories washing over her. "He wasn't perfect, but he would have been a good father." Jake nodded solemnly. "I'm sure he would have been." He stood, dusting off his hands. "I'll give you some privacy." Call if you need anything. As he walked toward Samson to check the saddle, Sarah found herself watching him again. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made her feel that perhaps the future wasn't as bleak as it had seemed when she was wandering alone in the wilderness. They continued their journey after the brief rest, the landscape gradually changing as they approached more settled country. By late afternoon, Sarah could see smoke from chimneys in the distance. Redemption, Jake confirmed when she asked. We'll be there before sunset. The town was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 30 buildings lining a main street, with scattered homesteads visible on the surrounding hillsides. As they rode down the main street, Sarah noticed people stopping to stare. A woman and baby riding double with a cowboy was apparently enough to attract attention in Redemption. Jake guided Samson to a 2-story clapboard building with a small sign reading, Peterson Boarding House. Before they could dismount, the front door opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun stepped onto the porch. Jacob Xavier, she called, placing her hands on her hips. It's been nearly 6 months since you passed through. Thought maybe the Indians or the winter got you. Jake tipped his hat. Mrs. Peterson, good to see you too. The woman's gaze shifted to Sarah and Emma. Her expression softened immediately. And who do we have here? Jake dismounted first, then helped Sarah down, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow when her legs wobbled after the long ride. This is Sarah Turner and her daughter Emma. They've had a rough go of it. Stagecoach robbery, 3 days ago. Her husband didn't make it. Mrs. Peterson's face fell. Oh, you poor dear. She stepped forward, ushering Sarah toward the house. Come in. Come in. You look dead on your feet. And that baby needs to be somewhere warm. Sarah glanced back at Jake, suddenly reluctant to leave his side. Go on, he encouraged gently. Mrs. Peterson will take good care of you. I need to see to Samson and report the robbery to the sheriff. Will you? Sarah hesitated. Will you come back? To let me know what the sheriff says? Something flashed in Jake's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or warmth. Of course. I'll be back before supper. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was clean and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. The older woman led Sarah to a small but comfortable room on the second floor, talking all the while about how she'd make up a little bed for the baby and find some proper clothes for both of them. Jake said you might have work, Sarah ventured when Mrs. Peterson finally paused for breath. I don't have money to pay for lodging, but I can cook and clean. I'm a quick learner. Mrs. Peterson assessed her with kind but shrewd eyes. We'll talk about that after you've had a proper meal and some rest. No decisions when you're exhausted and grieving. She gestured to a door across the hall. Washroom's there. I'll bring up hot water and find something clean for you and the little one to wear. Alone in the room, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, Emma still in her arms. The events of the past few days crashed over her Thomas's death, her desperate flight, the kindness of a stranger who had possibly saved both their lives. She held Emma close and allowed herself to cry properly for the first time since the robbery. That was how Jake found her an hour later, after Mrs. Peterson had directed him upstairs. He knocked softly on the half-open door. Sarah looked up, hastily wiping her tears with one hand while cradling a sleeping Emma with the other. She had washed and changed into a simple blue dress that Mrs. Peterson had provided, her hair neatly braided and hanging over one shoulder. I'm sorry, she said, embarrassed to be caught crying. Please, come in. Jake stepped into the room, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. No need to apologize. You've been through more than most could handle. He gestured to the chair beside the bed. May I? Sarah nodded, and he sat, placing his hat on his knee. I spoke with Sheriff Davis. He's sending wires to Fort Benton and Silverton about the robbery. The Blackwater gang has hit 3 coaches in the past month. Army's organizing a patrol, but... He shrugged. Territory's big, and they're always a step ahead. Will they be caught? Sarah asked. Eventually? Men like that make mistakes, get greedy. Justice might be slow out here, but it comes. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. Sheriff asked if you wanted to make a statement about what happened. Said it can wait until you're feeling stronger. Sarah nodded, grateful for the reprieve. The thought of recounting that terrible day in detail made her stomach churn. Thank you for speaking to him on my behalf. Jake nodded. Mrs. Peterson says you're welcome to stay here as long as needed. He hesitated. I settled your bill for the next 2 weeks. Should give you time to get on your feet. Sarah stared at him in shock. Jake. No, that's too much. You've already done so much for us. It's not charity, he said firmly. It's what decent folks do for each other out here. The territory's harsh enough without turning our backs on those in need. Sarah wanted to protest further but found herself too overwhelmed by his generosity. I'll pay you back. Somehow. No need. Jake stood, placing his hat back on his head. I should let you rest. Mrs. Peterson said supper's at 6. Will you join us? Sarah asked, surprising herself with the question. Jake paused at the door. I wasn't planning to. Please? Sarah couldn't explain the wave of anxiety that washed over her at the thought of him leaving. Emma and I would like the company. A small smile touched Jake's lips. Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse an invitation from 2 lovely ladies? At supper, Sarah discovered that the boarding house currently had 3 other residents: a schoolteacher named Miss Collins, an elderly prospector called Old Pete, and a young store clerk named Henry. Mrs. Peterson presided over the meal with cheerful efficiency, keeping conversation flowing and making sure everyone's plate stayed full. Sarah remained quiet through most of the meal, overwhelmed by being around so many people after days of isolation. Jake, seated beside her, seemed to sense her discomfort and occasionally deflected questions directed her way, giving her space to adjust. Emma, freshly fed and wrapped in a clean blanket that Mrs. Peterson had produced, slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle, a dresser drawer lined with soft flannel. Several times during the meal, Sarah glanced over to check on her, only to find Jake doing the same. After supper, when the other boarders had retired to the parlor, Mrs. Peterson pulled Sarah aside. I've been thinking about your situation, the older woman said kindly. I do need help around here, cooking, cleaning, mending. The work's not too hard, and you can keep the baby with you. Room and board included, plus a small wage. Relief washed over Sarah. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I accept gratefully. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. Good. You start when you're ready, no rush. Her eyes drifted to where Jake stood by the window, smoking a cigarette. He's a good man, that one. Doesn't stay in one place long, but he's always welcome here. Sarah followed her gaze. He saved our lives. Not surprised. He's got a habit of showing up when people need him most. Mrs. Peterson's expression grew thoughtful. Never seen him bring anyone to my door before, though. You must have made quite an impression. Before Sarah could respond, Jake approached. Mrs. Peterson, thank you for the fine meal. I should be heading out. The older woman waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense, it's dark, and the hotel charges too much. Your usual room is available. Jake hesitated, glancing at Sarah. I don't want to impose. It's no imposition, Mrs. Peterson insisted. Besides, I expect this young lady might rest easier knowing you're under the same roof tonight. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but couldn't deny the truth in Mrs. Peterson's words. The thought of Jake leaving, of being truly on her own in this strange town, sent a ripple of anxiety through her. Please stay, she said quietly. Jake studied her face for a moment, then nodded. All right. One night. That night, alone in her room with Emma sleeping nearby, Sarah found herself unable to rest despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas falling from the stagecoach, heard the bandits' laughter, felt the terror of running through the wilderness with her baby clutched to her chest. A soft knock at her door startled her from these dark thoughts. She pulled on the dressing gown Mrs. Peterson had lent her and opened the door a crack. Jake stood in the hallway, still fully dressed except for his hat and boots. "Heard you pacing," he explained. "Thought you might want some company. Or not. Sorry if I overstepped." Sarah opened the door wider. "No, I can't seem to sleep. Too many thoughts." Jake nodded in understanding. "Mind if I check on the little one?" Sarah stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He moved quietly to the makeshift cradle, looking down at Emma with an expression that made Sarah's heart constrict strangely. "She's a fighter," he said softly, "like her mother." Sarah joined him beside the cradle. "I don't feel very strong. I'm terrified, Jake. I don't know how to do this alone." "You're not alone," he replied, his voice firm. "Not anymore." Sarah looked up at him, studying his face in the dim light from the single lamp. "You've already done more than anyone could expect. I can't ask for more." Jake's gaze was steady. "You're not asking. I'm offering." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain. "I have to head north in a few days. Army Scout work. But I'll be back through redemption in a month or so. I'd like to check on you both then, if that's all right." The thought of him leaving sent an unexpected pang through Sarah's chest. This man had been a stranger just 24 hours ago, yet somehow the idea of continuing without his steady presence seemed daunting. "We'd like that," she said finally. "Emma and I." Jake smiled a real smile that transformed his serious face. Then it settled. He moved toward the door. "Try to get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow's a new day." After he left, Sarah found sleep came easier. The promise of Jake's return, the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone in the world anymore, eased some of the fear that had been her constant companion since the stagecoach robbery. The next few days established a routine. Sarah began helping Mrs. Peterson with the boarding house, learning the older woman's systems and schedules. Emma became the unofficial mascot of the house, with even gruff old Pete softening when the baby gripped his gnarled finger with her tiny hand. Jake remained in redemption, taking odd jobs around town and spending evenings at the boarding house. He never said as much, but Sarah suspected he was delaying his departure north to ensure she and Emma were truly settled. On the fourth day, Sarah finally felt ready to give her statement to Sheriff Davis. Jake accompanied her to the sheriff's office, holding Emma while Sarah recounted the details of the robbery. Reliving Thomas's death was painful, but somehow having Jake beside her made it bearable. "You've been very brave, Mrs. Turner," Sheriff Davis said when she finished. "I'm sorry for your loss. We'll do everything we can to bring these men to justice." As they left the sheriff's office, Jake seemed unusually quiet. They walked back toward the boarding house in silence, Emma sleeping peacefully in Jake's arms. "I have to leave tomorrow," he finally said as they reached Mrs. Peterson's front gate. "Captain Reynolds sent word they need scouts for a mapping expedition near the Canadian border." Although she'd been expecting this announcement, Sarah felt her heart sink. "Of course. You have responsibilities." Jake shifted Emma to one arm and reached into his pocket with his free hand. "I want you to have this." He pressed something into Sarah's palm, a folded wad of bills. "It's not much, but it should help until you get on your feet properly." Sarah stared at the money, then back at Jake. "I can't accept this." "You can, and you will," he said firmly. "For Emma, if not for yourself." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "When will you return?" "A month, maybe 6 weeks. Depends on the weather and what we find up north." He looked down at Emma, his expression softening. "She'll probably have changed so much by then." "We'll be here," Sarah promised, "and I'll pay you back every cent." Jake shook his head. "That's not why I'm helping you." "Then why are you?" The question had been on Sarah's mind for days. Why would this man, this stranger, go to such lengths for a widow and an orphaned baby? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because when I found you in the wilderness, holding your baby wrapped in rags, something changed for me. His voice dropped lower. I've been wandering most of my life, Sarah. Never felt tied to any place or person. But when I held Emma, when I saw how hard you fought to keep her safe, he trailed off, seeming embarrassed by his own words. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Jake. No need to say anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not expecting anything from you. You're grieving. You're starting over. I just want you to know that you have a friend in me. Always. He handed Emma back to Sarah, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. I should go pack. Early start tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. Jake. When he looked back, she continued, Be careful out there. A smile touched his lips. Always am. The next morning, Sarah stood on the boarding house porch with Emma in her arms, watching as Jake checked Samson's saddle one final time. Mrs. Peterson had packed him food for the journey, and the other boarders had come out to wish him well. When he approached Sarah to say goodbye, she found herself fighting tears again. A month isn't so long, she said, trying to sound cheerful. Jake nodded, reaching out to touch Emma's cheek with one finger. Take care of your mama, little one, he said softly. Then, to Sarah, if you need anything, anything at all, Mrs. Peterson knows how to get word to me. We'll be fine, Sarah assured him, though her heart felt heavy. Thank you, Jake, for everything. He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he tipped his hat, mounted Samson, and rode away without looking back. Sarah watched until he disappeared from view, Emma warm against her chest. Only then did she let the tears fall. He'll be back, Mrs. Peterson said quietly, coming to stand beside her. That man has something to come back for now. The weeks following Jake's departure settled into a rhythm. Sarah worked hard at the boarding house, learning to balance her duties with caring for Emma. Mrs. Peterson proved to be a godsend, part employer, part mentor, part surrogate grandmother to Emma. Under her guidance, Sarah began to feel less like a helpless victim and more like a woman capable of forging a new life. News came sporadically from the north. A passing Army lieutenant mentioned that the scouting expedition had encountered heavy rains and difficult terrain, but was making progress. Another traveler reported seeing a scout matching Jake's description near Fort Assiniboine. Each snippet of information reassured Sarah that he was alive, at least. As the fourth week without Jake stretched into the fifth, Sarah found herself watching the road more frequently, hoping to see a familiar figure on a chestnut horse. Emma, now nearly 5 months old, was changing daily, smiling more, reaching for objects, babbling in her own language. Sarah often found herself thinking how much she wanted Jake to see these changes, then feeling guilty for such thoughts when her husband had been dead barely 2 months. Grief isn't linear, Mrs. Peterson told her one evening when she confessed these conflicted feelings. And the heart doesn't follow rules or timelines. Thomas would want you and Emma to be happy, wouldn't he? Sarah nodded, remembering her husband's easy laugh and optimistic nature. Yes, he would. He always said life was for the living. Smart man, Mrs. Peterson replied. Honor his memory by living fully, not by punishing yourself. The advice helped, but the confusion remained. Sarah had known Jake for such a short time. How could she be missing him so intensely? Was it merely gratitude or something deeper? 6 weeks after Jake's departure, a tremendous thunderstorm struck Redemption. Lightning split the sky as rain pounded the town, turning the main street into a river of mud. Sarah had just put Emma down for the night when a pounding at the front door startled her. She hurried downstairs to find Mrs. Peterson already at the door, opening it to reveal a drenched figure supporting a second, barely conscious man. "Jake!" Sarah gasped, recognizing him despite the mud and blood covering his face. "Need help," Jake managed, struggling under the weight of his companion. "Army patrol ambushed by renegades. Davis is hurt bad." Mrs. Peterson sprang into action. "Sarah, fetch Doctor and Wilson. Tell him to hurry. Henry!" she called to the young clerk. "Help get these men inside." Sarah grabbed a shawl and ran into the storm, splashing through puddles to the doctor's house 3 doors down. By the time she returned with Dr. Wilson, Jake had been helped to a chair in the kitchen, while the injured soldier lay on the dining table, Mrs. Peterson already cutting away his blood-soaked uniform. "Sarah," Jake said hoarsely when he saw her. His right arm hung at an awkward angle, and a gash on his forehead was still bleeding freely. "Don't talk," she ordered, kneeling beside his chair and beginning to clean his wound. "What happened?" "Blackwater gang," he managed, wincing as she dabbed at the cut. "They've joined forces with some renegade Sioux, ambushed our patrol near Beaver Creek." Sarah's hands froze. "The same gang that killed Thomas?" Jake nodded grimly. "Pretty sure. Sheriff Davis needs to know. They're heading this way." As Dr. Wilson worked on the critically injured soldier, Jake insisted on going to alert the sheriff despite his own injuries. Sarah and Henry supported him through the continuing downpour to the sheriff's office, where he quickly explained the situation. "How many?" Sheriff Davis demanded. "At least 15 men," Jake replied. "Well armed. They hit us at dawn, took our horses and supplies. Davis and I barely got away. The others—" He shook his head grimly. The sheriff immediately began organizing the town's defense, sending riders to warn outlying farms and organizing the able-bodied men into patrols. By the time they returned to the boarding house, Dr. Wilson had stabilized the injured soldier but looked grave. "He needs more care than I can provide here. If he survives the night, we should try to get him to Fort Benton." Jake nodded, swaying slightly on his feet. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, the toll of his injuries and exhaustion was becoming apparent. "You need rest," Sarah said firmly, taking his uninjured arm. "Doctor, can you look at his shoulder?" Dr. Wilson quickly examined Jake. "Dislocated. I need to set it now before swelling makes it worse." He looked at Sarah. "Hold him steady. This will hurt." Sarah positioned herself behind Jake, her arms wrapped around his chest. She could feel him trembling slightly from pain and exhaustion. "Ready?" Dr. Wilson asked. Jake nodded once, jaw clenched. The doctor manipulated the joint with practiced movements. Jake made no sound as the shoulder popped back into place. But Sarah felt his entire body go rigid with pain. She held him tighter, murmuring words of comfort against his ear. After Dr. Wilson left, prescribing rest and promising to return in the morning, Sarah helped Jake to his room. He moved like a man twice his age, each step clearly painful. "Emma?" he asked as Sarah helped him sit on the edge of his bed. "Sleeping through all the excitement," Sarah assured him, touched that, in his condition, his thoughts were of her daughter. "She's fine." Jake nodded, relief crossing his features. "Good. That's good." Sarah helped him remove his mud-caked boots and jacket, careful of his injured shoulder. "You need to get out of these wet clothes," she said practically. "I'll find you something dry." Jake caught her wrist as she turned to leave. "Sarah, the gang. They're coming for the bank and the assay office. Town won't be safe." Sarah felt cold fear wash over her. "When?" 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on the weather." His grip on her wrist tightened slightly. "You and Emma should leave. Go to Fort Benton until it's over." Sarah shook her head firmly. "This is our home now. I'm not running again." Jake looked like he wanted to argue but was too exhausted. His hand fell away from her wrist. "Stubborn woman," he muttered. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Sarah found herself smiling. "Get some rest, Jake. We'll figure things out in the morning." As she turned to leave, Jake spoke again, his voice softer. I missed you both. Thought about you every day. Sarah paused at the door, her heart beating faster. We missed you too, she admitted quietly. The next morning brought clear skies and growing tension in Redemption. Sheriff Davis called a town meeting to discuss the threat. The bank was fortified, valuables moved to hidden locations, and a defensive perimeter established. Women and children were encouraged to leave town if possible, but most, like Sarah, refused to abandon their homes. Jake, despite his injuries, insisted on helping with the preparations. Sarah watched with concern as he moved around town, his arm in a sling but his determination undiminished. When he returned to the boarding house that evening, he looked pale with exhaustion. You're pushing yourself too hard, Sarah chided as she served him supper in the kitchen. The other boarders had gone to stay with relatives outside town, leaving only Mrs. Peterson, Sarah, Emma, and Jake. No choice, Jake replied, though he smiled at her concern. Every able body counts right now. Sarah sat across from him, Emma sleeping in her lap. Tell me honestly, how bad will it be? Jake considered her question, his expression serious. Sheriffs organized things well. We have the advantage of preparation, but they outnumber us, and they're desperate. It won't be easy. Sarah nodded, appreciating his honesty. What can I do to help? Keep Emma safe, Jake said immediately. Stay inside, away from windows. If shooting starts, get to the root cellar. He hesitated. And if things go badly, there's a trail behind the livery that leads to Miller's Creek. Follow it north. It'll take you to Fort Benton eventually. The matter-of-fact way he discussed her potential escape made Sarah's throat tighten with fear. Promise me you'll be careful, she said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Emma and I need you to come back. Jake's eyes widened slightly at her words, his fingers curled around hers. I promise. The Blackwater gang arrived the next day at noon, riding boldly down the main street of Redemption as if they owned it. From her position at an upstairs window of the boarding house, Sarah counted 12 men, heavily armed and looking confident. The leader, a tall man with a black beard and a scar running down one cheek, reined in his horse in front of the sheriff's office. Davis, he bellowed, we know you're in there. Come out and maybe we won't burn this town to the ground. There was no response from the silent buildings. The gang members looked around uneasily, clearly expecting to see townspeople fleeing in terror, not empty streets. Something's wrong, Sarah whispered. Jake stood beside her, watching the scene below with narrowed eyes. They're realizing it's a trap, he confirmed. But they're too greedy to leave without trying for the bank. The leader signaled his men to spread out. As they moved toward the bank, shots rang out from several buildings. 2 gang members fell immediately, while the others scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly. Get to the cellar, Jake ordered, checking his revolver. Now. Sarah clutched Emma to her chest, the baby awakened and crying from the gunfire. Be careful, she pleaded. Jake's expression softened for a moment. He leaned down and pressed a quick, fierce kiss to her forehead. Go. Sarah hurried downstairs to the root cellar, where Mrs. Peterson was already waiting. The older woman took Emma, allowing Sarah to secure the heavy door behind them. Above, the sound of gunfire intensified. Occasional shouts and the crash of breaking glass penetrated even the thick cellar walls. Emma continued crying, frightened by the noise and the tension she could sense in the adults. Sing to her, Mrs. Peterson suggested, handing the baby back to Sarah. It might help. Sarah began a soft lullaby, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. She thought of Jake above, risking his life to protect the town, to protect her and Emma, the same way Thomas had tried to protect them on the stagecoach. The parallel made her stomach clench with fear. The gunfight seemed to last forever. Eventually, the shooting became more sporadic, then stopped altogether. Sarah and Mrs. Peterson exchanged hopeful glances, but neither moved toward the cellar door. It could be a trick. Or worse, the gang could have won. They waited in tense silence for what felt like hours. Emma had finally fallen asleep against Sarah's shoulder when they heard footsteps above, then a knock at the cellar door. "Sarah? Mrs. Peterson?" Jake's voice, strained but unmistakable. Sarah handed Emma to Mrs. Peterson and rushed to unlock the door. Jake stood at the top of the steps, dusty and bloodied but alive. Without thinking, Sarah threw herself into his arms, mindful of his injured shoulder, but needing to feel that he was real, that he had survived. Jake's good arm wrapped around her waist, holding her tightly against him. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "We got them. All of them." Sarah pulled back enough to see his face. "Anyone hurt?" "2 townsmen wounded, but they'll recover. One of the gang surrendered, he's in jail. The rest?" Jake shook his head grimly. Mrs. Peterson appeared at the top of the steps with Emma. "The leader? The one with the scar?" "Dead," Jake confirmed. "Sheriff Davis got him as he tried to escape." Sarah felt a complex wave of emotions, relief that the danger had passed, sadness for the loss of life, and a strange sense of closure. The men who had murdered Thomas were gone. They couldn't hurt anyone else. "I need to help with the cleanup," Jake said, reluctantly releasing Sarah. "Will you be all right?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how she had thrown herself at him. "Yes, of course. Go." The aftermath of the gunfight kept the town busy for days. Damages were repaired, the dead buried, and slowly, life in Redemption began to return to normal. The surviving gang member provided information that led to the recovery of stolen goods from several stagecoach robberies, including some of Thomas's possessions that had been taken the day he died. Sheriff Davis presented Sarah with Thomas's pocket watch and wedding ring. "Thought you might want these," he said gently. "For Emma, when she's older." Sarah accepted the items gratefully, feeling a chapter of her life closing. That evening, she sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset with Emma in her lap. The baby was fascinated by the gold watch, batting at it with her tiny hands. "That's from your papa," Sarah told her softly. "He was a good man who loved you very much." "Mind if I join you?" Jake's voice came from the doorway. Sarah looked up with a smile. "Please do." He sat beside her on the porch swing, his shoulder healed enough that he no longer needed the sling. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. "Army sent word," Jake said eventually. "They've offered me a permanent position as a scout. Good pay, stable work." Sarah felt her heart sink. "You're leaving again." "Actually," Jake turned to face her. "I turned them down." Surprise made Sarah look up sharply. "But why? You said it was good pay, and you enjoy scouting." Jake reached out to touch Emma's cheek gently. The baby immediately grabbed his finger, gurgling happily. "Found something I enjoy more." Sarah's heart began to race. "Jake, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I respect that. But I want you to know that I care deeply for you and Emma. These past weeks, even when I was away, you were all I could think about." He took a deep breath. "I've taken a job at Miller's Ranch outside town. Foreman position. It comes with a small house." His eyes met hers, vulnerable but determined. "I'm not asking for anything right now, Sarah. Just the chance to be near you both, to help when I can, and maybe someday." Sarah placed her hand over his where it rested on the swing between them. "Jake," she said softly. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. Then you found us in the wilderness, and you gathered Emma and me into your arms and called us yours." Jake's expression was a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I remember." "No one had ever made me feel so safe," Sarah continued. "These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing how you are with Emma, I'm not ready to let go of Thomas completely, but I'm not willing to let go of you either. Jake turned his hand to clasp hers. We can take it as slow as you need. Sarah nodded, relief and something like happiness washing over her. I'd like that. The months that followed brought gradual, healing changes. Jake moved into his position at Miller's Ranch, but spent most evenings at the boarding house. He became a constant in Sarah and Emma's life, reading to the baby, helping Sarah with her chores, accompanying them on walks through town. As summer turned to fall, Sarah found herself falling in love almost without realizing it. It wasn't the passionate, impulsive love she had felt for Thomas as a young girl. This was deeper, built on foundation of respect, shared experiences, and genuine care. Emma adored Jake, reaching for him whenever he entered a room. Her first clear word after Mama was Jay, her attempt at his name. The look on Jake's face when he heard it was something Sarah knew she would remember forever. On Emma's first birthday, Jake took them on a picnic by the creek outside town. Emma, now walking with assistance, toddled between them on the blanket, giggling as butterflies fluttered nearby. I have something for you, Jake said after they had eaten. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. For Emma, actually, but I wanted to give it to you first. Sarah opened the box to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny portrait, Thomas on one side and Jake on the other. I had an artist in Fort Benton make it from the photograph you have of Thomas, Jake explained. I thought, when she's older, she should know both the men who loved her. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Jake, I don't have words. There's something else, he said, suddenly looking nervous. He took the box back and removed a false bottom, revealing a simple gold ring. Sarah Turner, I love you. I love Emma as if she were my own. I want to spend my life with you both, if you'll have me. Sarah looked at the man before her, this kind, steady, honorable man who had saved them in more ways than one. Yes, she said simply. Yes, we'll have you. They were married 2 weeks later in Redemption's small church. Mrs. Peterson stood as Sarah's witness, while Sheriff Davis stood for Jake. Emma, dressed in a white dress Mrs. Peterson had sewn, sat contentedly in Jake's arms throughout the ceremony, playing with his watch chain and occasionally patting his face as if to make sure he was still there. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss your bride. Jake handed Emma to Mrs. Peterson before taking Sarah into his arms. His kiss was gentle, but full of promise, a beginning, rather than an ending. That evening, after Emma had been put to bed in their new home on Miller's Ranch, Sarah and Jake sat on the porch steps, watching the stars appear one by one. Happy? Jake asked, his arm around her shoulders. Sarah leaned into him, feeling truly content for the first time in over a year. Very. Are you? Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. More than I ever thought possible. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here, the tragedy, the pain, the unexpected joy. Life takes strange turns, she mused. A year ago, I was wandering in the wilderness, certain Emma and I would die there. And I was drifting through life with no real purpose, Jake added. Funny how things work out. Sarah turned to face her husband, cupping his cheek in her hand. Thank you for finding us, for saving us. Jake covered her hand with his own. You saved me too, Sarah. You and Emma. Gave me something to live for. A place to belong. He smiled, that rare, full smile that still made her heart race. You gave me a family? Inside the house, Emma made a small sound in her sleep. Jake immediately stood, ever attentive to the child he now called daughter. I'll check on her. Sarah watched as he went inside, this man who had once been a stranger and was now the center of her world. She thought of Thomas briefly, sending a silent thank you to the husband who had loved her first. Then she followed Jake inside, to the life they were building together, a life that had begun on a cold night in the wilderness, when her baby slept wrapped in rags, and a cowboy gathered them both into his arms and called them his. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Jake taught their 4-year-old son James to ride his pony in the fenced corral. Emma, now 6, sat astride her own small horse, already a confident rider under her father's careful instruction. "Look, Mama," Emma called, guiding her pony in a small circle. "I'm doing it all by myself." "I see you, sweetheart," Sarah called back, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their third child grew. The doctor had predicted another 2 months before the baby would arrive, just in time for winter. Jake looked up, catching Sarah's eye across the yard. His smile still had the power to warm her from the inside out. 5 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, each challenge and joy bringing them closer together. The ranch had prospered under Jake's management. What had started as a foreman's position had evolved into a partnership with old Mr. Miller, who had come to think of Jake as the son he never had. Last year, Miller had officially made Jake co-owner, ensuring the ranch would pass to him when the older man was gone. Sarah stepped down from the porch, making her way carefully to the corral. Jake immediately moved to meet her, concern crossing his features. "You should be resting," he chided gently, placing a supportive hand at the small of her back. Sarah leaned into him slightly. "I've been resting all morning. Besides, it's too beautiful a day to spend indoors." Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. "Stubborn as always." "You wouldn't have me any other way," she replied with a smile. "No," he agreed, his eyes warm. "I wouldn't." Emma trotted her pony over to the fence. "Mama, can we go on a picnic? Please? You promised we could when the weather was nice." Sarah exchanged a glance with Jake, who nodded. I think that can be arranged. James, would you like a picnic?" Their son, a miniature version of Jake with Sarah's blue eyes, bounced excitedly in his tiny saddle. "Yes. Can we go to the creek? With the frogs?" "The creek it is," Jake declared. He helped Sarah back to the house to prepare the food, while the children continued their riding lessons under the watchful eye of Pedro, their ranch hand. As they worked together in the kitchen, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The pain of Thomas's death had faded to a gentle sadness, a chapter in her life that had shaped her, but no longer defined her. Emma kept his picture beside her bed and asked questions about him occasionally, which Sarah answered honestly. "You're quiet," Jake observed as he packed bread and cheese into a basket. Sarah smiled, slicing apples for the children. "Just thinking how fortunate we are. How far we've come." Jake set down the basket and moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her expanded waistline and resting his chin on her shoulder. "From a desperate meeting in the wilderness to this, I'd say we've been blessed." Sarah turned in his arms, careful of her belly. "Do you ever think about that night? When you found Emma and me?" "Often," Jake admitted. "I think about how close I came to missing you altogether. If I'd camped a mile in any other direction." Sarah shuddered at the thought. "Providence. Or fate," Jake suggested. "Either way, I'm grateful every day." The sound of hooves and children's laughter drew their attention to the window. Emma and James were circling the yard on their ponies, their faces alight with joy. "We should go before they wear themselves out completely," Sarah said with a laugh. Jake loaded the picnic basket and blankets into their wagon, while Sarah gathered extra clothes for the children, knowing they would inevitably end up splashing in the creek. The family set off toward their favorite spot, the children riding their ponies alongside the wagon. The creek was at its most beautiful in early autumn, the surrounding trees just beginning to turn gold and red. Jake spread blankets in a sunny spot while Sarah unpacked the food. Emma and James, having been helped down from their ponies, immediately ran to the water's edge to look for frogs. "Not too close to the deep part," Jake called, his protective instincts never far from the surface. Sarah smiled as she arranged their simple meal. Some things never changed Jake's watchfulness, his constant care for all of them. Other things had evolved beautifully over time, like Emma's understanding of their unconventional family story. Last year, when Emma had asked why she had two fathers when other children had only one, Sarah had explained as simply as she could about Thomas's death and Jake's rescue. "Your first father loved you so much he gave his life trying to protect us," she had told her daughter. "And your second father loved you so much he gathered us into his arms when we had nothing and called us his." Emma had considered this solemnly before declaring, "Then I'm the luckiest girl in redemption, because I got to have two daddies who really loved me." Now, watching Jake help James catch a tiny frog while Emma provided expert advice from her superior 6-year-old perspective, Sarah felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was her family, unexpected, hard-won, and more precious than anything she could have imagined during those dark days after Thomas's death. Jake glanced up, catching her watching them. He said something to the children before walking back to join her on the blanket. "Everything all right?" he asked, settling beside her. Sarah nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "Everything is perfect." Jake placed his hand on her belly, smiling as he felt the baby kick. "What do you think? Boy or girl this time?" "Girl," Sarah said confidently. "We're going to name her Hope." Jake's eyebrows rose. "We are? When did we decide that?" Sarah laughed. "Just now, because that's what you gave me, Jake Xavier, when I had none left." Jake's expression softened. He leaned forward to kiss her, a tender gesture that still held all the promise of their future together. "Hope it is, then." By the creek, Emma had successfully caught a frog and was showing it to her little brother, who watched with wide-eyed fascination. The autumn sun filtered through the changing leaves, casting dappled patterns across their children's faces. In a few months they would welcome another life into their family, another chapter in a story that had begun on the edge of despair and blossomed into something beautiful. Sarah had once believed her life ended with Thomas on that blood-soaked stagecoach. Instead, it had taken an unexpected turn when a cowboy found her in the wilderness, her baby wrapped in rags, and gathered them both into his arms. What had started as an act of kindness had grown into a love that sustained them all, a love that would continue to grow and change as their family did the same. As Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders, Sarah offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the healing power of love, and for the family that had been forged from tragedy and hope in equal measure. Their story was not the one she had imagined for herself as a young bride in Ohio, but it was deeper, richer, and more meaningful than anything she could have dreamed. Emma's laughter rang out across the creek as James finally managed to hold the squirming frog. Jake chuckled beside her, the sound vibrating through Sarah where their bodies touched. "I love you," she said simply, words that could never fully express the depth of her feelings. Jake kissed the top of her head. "And I love you. All of you." As the afternoon sun warmed them, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the family that fate and choice had built, stronger for having been broken, more precious for having almost been lost. In the end, that was all that mattered.